And welcome back, everybody. I hope that everybody revived themselves with a nice coffee and some biscuits. So the next session that we are having today is called Vocal Pedagogy, Historical and Continuous Perspectives. And we are going to have two papers in this session. First, Rebecca Troy is going to start with her presentation, followed by Francesco Venturi. And I'm going to introduce the speakers before their talk. So let me just start with Rebecca. Rebecca completed her master's in history from University College London with interests in histories of gender and transnational histories of opera. Her dissertation project was entitled Bodies of Work, Castrati Experiences in Late 18th Century Europe, which considered the position and reception of castrati as their popularity on European operatic stages declined. So I think that we are going to hear something about this topic as well, as a continuation of her master's and probably some forward to her upcoming potential PhD. Please welcome Rebecca.
Okay. Hi everyone. Let me just start my timer. Okay. All right. Hello everyone, I'm Bex and this is my very first conference paper. I wanted to begin by saying thank you all for coming and thank you to Barbara and the Theatre and Voice Research Centre for organising this conference. This paper draws out one of the ideas that I developed in my master's dissertation, which investigated the experience of operatic castrati in the late 18th and early 19th century Europe. I refer to the group of singers in my talk today as Late-Operatic castrati because they were performing and working at a time when castrati were dramatically declining in popularity on the operatic stage, following a period of enormous popularity earlier in the 18th century, and are distinct from castrati who sang in religious contexts, a practice which would continue into the 20th century. This paper argues that emphasising the role of late operatic castrati as voice teachers creates an opportunity to re-evaluate the position of castrato in late 18th and early 19th century Europe. I'll be utilising a transnational approach, engaging with the idea that castrati, in abstract, was seen as representative of Italy to French and British audiences at the time, embodying many of the negative aspects of Italianità, such as effeminacy and luxury. The two late operatic castrati I focus on today are useful for complicating a conception of Italianità in France and Britain because of their mobility, actually travelling to both of these countries, and their agency as voice teachers. So, Venanzio Rausini was born in 1746 in Camerino and was a successful singer, composer, concert impresario and singing teacher. He performed all over Europe and performed in London for the first time in 1774 and then chose to remain in Britain. He permanently settled in Bath in 1780 and directed subscription concerts there from 1777 until his death in 1810. During his time directing concert series, he became one of the most sought-after voice teachers in Britain. Girolamo Crescentini was another performer, composer and singing teacher and was one of Napoleon's favourite singers. In 1796, Zingarelli would write the part of Romeo in his Giulietta and Romeo for Crescentini. He taught soprano Isabella Colbran, Rossini's wife and muse, and would teach at the Real Collegio di Musica in Naples. Both Crescentini and Rausini wrote successful treatises on singing, allowing us to get a sense of their teaching approaches and pedagogy. For the rest of this paper, I'll be engaging with their writings and demonstrating that they are rich sites for exploring, and in some cases challenging, prevalent narratives surrounding castrati. They also allow for intervention by assigning agency to late operatic castrati, allowing them to speak for themselves in a historiography that is dominated by sources about, rather than by, these historical actors. Considering works written by castrati themselves is important for positioning them as historical agents rather than subjects of the discourses around them. These are the main sources that I'll be referring back to in this paper, both from the Royal College of Music Special Collections Library. On the left is Crescentini's Raccolta di Esercizi, originally written in French and Italian, whilst Crescentini was in Paris teaching for the Napoleonic court and imperial family from 1806 to 1812. Although the version on display on the board right now was written around 1810 in an Italian and German print. Rossini's 12 solfeggi, or exercises for the voice to be vocalised, was written towards the end of his life in 1808, and his signature is on the top right of this page here. His publishers would produce a further set of 12 solfeggi posthumously, but the veracity of the authorship of this second work is dubious. Both of the works follow a similar structure. They begin with a preface that explains the intended audience for the work, principles of singing, and how the work should be used. The rest of the texts are a series of exercises, increasing in complexity throughout, designed to be sung on the solfa syllables, or in some cases just the A vowel sound, hence the name solfeggi. This approach is associated with the old Italian school of singing, which Crescentini and Rossini would be familiar with through their own performance training, where students would engage with solfeggi for years before being encouraged to sing music with words. Their engagement with and advocacy for the old Italian school often results in the contributions of later operatic castrati being overlooked by music historians. However, both writers are operating under a very new 18th century under a new context from earlier authors, such as Pier Francesco Tosi, as by the end of the 18th century, many of the conservatori most closely associated with the old Italian school style had either closed or been consolidated into larger schools. Crescentini's Raccolta di Esercizi is striking because in several editions it's a bilingual text. The original work is in French and Italian, published during Crescentini's employment as a musician for the Napoleonic court. Another edition, held by the Royal College of Music, is written in German and Italian. In the French and German translations, there's additional instructions that are not included in their Italian counterparts. They both contain footnotes that explain that his exercises should be sung on the vowel A, suggesting that Italian readers did not need this clarification. The bilingual nature of the text confirms Italy as a centre for vocal pedagogy in Europe. Crescentini's work was written for a French audience. However, by having the Italian text alongside, the work is reframed as an Italian teaching that French audiences are able to access, rather than an output of French vocal pedagogy. At the end of the 18th century, France had an international reputation for poor singing, and Italy, conversely, a reputation for singing talent. Within France, music institutions were consciously derivative of their Italian counterparts, attempting to establish conservatori or even deliberately seeking out castrati as singing teachers. Therefore, the Italian lends the text an authority to French audiences as a useful work of vocal pedagogy because of Italy's reputation for excellent singing. The German and Italian edition also invites a transnational reading. This can be read in conversation with historian Caroline Kranz's insightful reading of a popular German music education text published just before in 1803, forgive my German pronunciation here, but Nina d'Albany's Brief an Nathalie über den Gesang. Kran takes a transnational approach to this text to locate an Italian voice, which d'Albany constructs a German national voice against. One of the inferences that Kran draws out from the work was the widespread sentiment in German-speaking countries that Italian people are naturally good at singing because of their language, national character, climate, and religion. Crescentini, however, presents Italian singing as both teachable and translatable, rather than innate, because of the detail and practicability of his work. This is significant because hidden behind the praise of Italians as instinctively good singers was usually a suggestion that this was because they were less civilized than other European countries. This is articulated in d'Albany's work, where she contrasts Italy's frequent everyday fare of sweet melodies, quote, with the inventive spirit, genius, and thoroughness of German music. A similar sentiment was articulated by proponents of Italian music in France during Le Chorale des Buffons, where in Rousseau's 1743 Lettre sur la musique française, Italian was presented as a language of melody, where French was a language of intellect. Castrati, as an institution, were enfolded into this relationship of civilization and music. Rousseau wrote later in his 1764 Dictionnaire de musique of the barbarity of the fathers of castrati. The mobility of the castrati and translation of their works can be read against rigid understandings of Italianità that understands Italian people as innately good at singing at the expense of other civilizing qualities. This is because Crescentini shows that his Italian method was translatable and teachable to his students and wider reading audience. The multiple bilingual editions of this text also speak to the widespread success of Crescentini as a vocal pedagogue, despite often being omitted from a canon of influential singing teachers. A close reading of Crescentini's 9th solfeggi exercise alongside his instructions from his Discorso Preliminare at the beginning of the text demonstrates the detail and practicability of his writing. Beyond a transnational reading that challenges contemporary conceptions of the innate singing ability of Italians, this degree of detail also challenges the idea that 18th and early 19th century works are opaque and unusable for 21st century practitioners compared to later 19th century writing on singing instruction. Whilst Crescentini does not provide a complete guide to singing because the work is aimed at experienced singers, he does offer comprehensive instructions for his intended audience to improve and perfect their craft. Exercise 9 is an adagio religioso, indicating a slow, religious tone, a style appropriate for a solemn hymn. This is one of the many musical genres within the Raccolta di esercizi per il canto, providing singers with opportunities to practice correct colorito. Crescentini explains in his introduction that colorito is the adjusting of the voice to the dominant feeling of the composition and of particular phrases, and explicitly outlines how the voice should be more suitable and soft in adagios and religious pieces, as with exercise 9. Exercise 9 is also heavily punctuated with accents. Some are simple, however most are complex and serve a didactic purpose in the work. For example, the A semibreve at the beginning of the exercise. With these complex accents, Crescentini provides a visual representation of the strength the singer should apply to accented notes. He explains in his introduction that this flexibility and strength is key to accessing other aspects of musicality, such as expression and accent. In exercise 9, Crescentini assigns trills to certain notes, for instance, in measure 8. However, he does not describe how this trill should be performed. This is not an accidental omission, but a pedagogical choice, he explains in his introduction. He wants his readers to practice selecting appropriate ornamentation themselves, rather than having a composer prescribe it to them. Throughout his introduction, he emphasizes the importance of expression in singing, describing the central aim of singing as to inspire tenderness and to touch the heart. Judicious use of ornamentation contributes to better expression, with his 12th principle of singing in his introduction reading, "Good taste in singing is nothing other than the expression of lyrics and those appropriate inflections." Reading an individual exercise alongside the Discorso Preliminare shows that Crescentini provides the reader with clear instructions not only for the exercises, but on performance and musicality in general. This is significant because it disrupts a canon of vocal pedagogy that characterises this level of detail as a later development. It also challenges a historiographical dismissal of castrato singing as mysterious or unknowable. Musicologist Robert St. Kirkland uses the work of Rousini, who I'll turn to next, to demonstrate how, despite being able to hear operatic castrati today, his treatise clearly articulates the techniques used to achieve their sound, demystifying their craft. This demystifying is essential for mitigating historiographies and music practices that dismiss their sound and, by extension, their contribution to operatic sound as completely unknowable. In the case of Crescentini, he was able to use Italy's and his own reputation for virtuosic singing in order to translate his methodology across different national contexts. Turning now to consider Rousini, we find an example of a castrato who was able to transcend an association with Italianità through his vocal pedagogy and teaching. With Rousini's work, I'll focus more on the social networks that his teaching created, something that he reflects upon in his own introductory letter to the work addressed to his scholars, or to my scholars. Rousini spent 34 years in Bath, and during this time he became one of the most sought-after voice teachers in England, teaching prominent opera singers such as Elizabeth Billington and John Braham, as well as upper-class women who sang in smaller concerts he organised in Bath. Significantly for a transnational reading, he's recognised by his contemporaries for his marked influence on an English vocal landscape. The anonymously written Memoirs of Signor Rousini describe how, in his career, he became the father of a new style in English singing and a new race of singers who have naturalised, to an English ear, the florid song and ornamental style of the Italians. Rousini was credited with bridging stylistic gaps between English and Italian musical traditions. Teaching singers, he became known as the first to sing in a new English style, hence the description as the father of a new English style of singing. In particular, Rousini was credited with realising a more expressive side of an already prominent soprano, Elizabeth Billington. This emphasis on expression separated Rossini from an English imagination of a castrato or Italian sound, characterised by dense ornamentation and vocal fireworks. This is reflected in his vocal treatise, 12 Solfeggi, where in his introduction, dedicated to his scholars, he writes, "Whatever you sing, let it be done with expression and precision. Those are the principal objects to be attended to." That a castrato could be the father of a new English style of singing demonstrates not only how castrati were able to participate in multiple national contexts, but also that vocal pedagogy was a significant way for castrati to leave legacies. Furthermore, their work as singing teachers also connected them to social networks with their students and beyond. Consideration of castrati as voice teachers is a helpful addition to recent historiographies that investigate other ways in which castrati gained social legitimacy and participated in networks and legacies, such as acquisition of wealth, aligning themselves with power or marriages and their annulments, but have not yet turned to their role as vocal pedagogues. We can use the position of these castrati as influential voice teachers to place them in a network of opera production, enabling us to rethink the historiography of castrato decline in the late 18th and early 19th century and trace their legacies further onto the 19th century operatic stage. Rossini's teaching, rather than his performances, cemented his status as the father of an English style of singing and allowed him to create vocal lineages and a legacy, something often denied to the infertile castrato. Historian Martha Feldman has identified multiple ways in which castrati were able to participate in social networks, citing adoption, often of nephews, extended international friendship networks, careful acquisitions of goods and money, careful management of their estates, heirs and bequests, and aligning themselves with male power, including rulership. I argue that their role as teachers should be counted among these methods of creating networks and legacies. Late-Operatic castrati created individual legacies through their vocal tuition in several ways. Crucially, their students were able to take their techniques into different operatic contexts and would often outlive them, in turn influencing others. Rossini uses his famous students to lend authority to his teaching methods, writing in his introduction, "Listen to Mara, Billington, Catalani, Grassini, Storacci, Graham, Viganoni, but do not imitate them." All of these figures mentioned were famous opera singers and former students of Rossini. As well as professional networks, their roles as singing teachers also connected them to social networks. Rossini's students of Society Women in Bath staged a benefit concert for him in 1794, when he was in dire financial straits, demonstrating their devotion and respect for him. In 1790, Hester Lynch Piozzi, a woman in Bath, asked in a letter to Reverend Thomas Sedgwick Worley, "Is Rossini going to marry an English lady and his scholar with a large fortune?" Suggesting that even though ultimately Rossini did not marry, it was not seen as an impossibility in Bath society, where normally marriage would be strictly prohibited for castrati. Rossini's teaching had transformed his social position. Now, I was only going to do this if I had time, but I think I've got just enough time to talk about this. Yeah. So this source here kind of speaks to the utility of using these vocal treatises to research castrati. So written here is a handwritten definition from Rees's Cyclopedia of a singing teacher, and it's on the overleaf of the Royal College of Music copy of Rossini's 12 Solfeggi. It's not written by Rossini because the definition itself was published in 1819, 9 years after he died, but it was written by his close associate James Wilson, who wrote all kinds of things in all of the manuscripts that he was left. I think it's significant because encyclopedias and dictionaries are an Enlightenment project, this being kind of a later extension of that. And castrati are often left out or characterised as like victims of the Enlightenment. So I think it's significant here that his student and close associate felt that they could incorporate them into this tradition. It's doubly significant because Rees's definition is heavily derivative of Rousseau's, who was a very vocal critic of castrati. So that one of his close associates felt that this did not matter and he could kind of transcend that, and he felt that he should write the definition of a singing teacher in the overleaf of Rossini's vocal treatise was significant. All right, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening to my paper. I hope it's demonstrated the value of these texts in exploring notions of Italianità. But I also wanted to say if anyone wants to come and chat to me about it, please do. I'm also developing a PhD proposal at the moment on the topic of 19th century divas and the ways in which their admirers could access them outside the opera house, so mainly through stuff. So feel free to come and chat to me about that as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bex. So our next speaker is Francesco Venturi, who is a musician and researcher, trained in composition at the Milan Conservatory and musicology at Goldsmiths University. He's a performer, he's a singer, and also a PhD candidate at Kingston University. And his research investigates how voices form and transform performative practice and pedagogy. So please welcome on the stage, Francesco.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Melinda, Bex, Barbara, and everyone in the room, including the technical staff, for such an interesting day, and also for yesterday. I'm glad that voice studies are such an interdisciplinary field, because now I'm going to move to places that are different from these, but actually you will see that we won't leave the field of opera so much. We just will explore it from a different point of view. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Think of a laugh. Not laughter in general, but one particular laugh. Someone's laugh. The way it breaks and falls. The shape it always takes. You would know it anywhere. A form like this is recognizable in a second from the other end of a telephone. It can be imitated, reproduced. It can become famous. It can be the unmistakable mark of a single person. And it can even be cloned. What I have spent the last year studying is the way such a form comes to happen. Where does it come from? What is this voice form? In the third act of Puccini's Fanciulla del West, the choir cries, "Allaccio, allaccio." They want to hang Johnson, though in the end they will spare him, out of love for Minnie. Years ago I was on stage singing Fanciulla, and I will never forget the way a colleague besides me sang Allaccio. It was closer to a slip than to a clean execution, and sung under the breath. Only I and one or two others even heard it. It came out of that very specific placing of his body. He probably forget it. I can still imitate it, exactly. An entire ecology had fallen into place for that person to make that form in that instant. So a voice form is not simply a sound. It's that ecology held in balance. It's an equilibrium struck for a time among a body, its nervous system, and the surrounding world. The sound is what such a balance gives off. The form is the balance itself. So that allaccio fell into place once and by accident. But a singer's art is the opposite. It's to bring such a form about on purpose and to bring it about again. So how is it that a certain phrase emerges more or less reliably? How can one person sing in one phrase across the ears in different rooms, different moods, different states of health, before different people, out of a body that is never twice the same, keep bringing into being a form you would recognize? So how a form comes to be and comes to be again, that is the question I want to open. I will speak throughout of opera, though opera is not really my subject, it's more of my case. It asks so much of a voice in such exacting ways that it brings these forms into the open. Opera singing prizes stability, the same phrase, the same timbre, the same placement, reproduced reliably over time. Yet it pursues that stability within a living system that never stops transforming. The body changes across a day and across months and years through adaptation, hormonal life, environmental changes, and aging. So how can a pedagogy oriented towards stability operate on a system traversed by continuous transformation? My hypothesis is that it does so not against that transformation, but from within it. Stabilizing a voice form and altering it are not two skills, but one. The same work that consolidates a certain gesture, a certain voice form, is what leaves it available to be retuned. To tackle this, I will explore 5 mechanisms. They are biological, but they operate at very different scales: material, neurological, cultural, temporal. I will take them one by one, and for each I will give an episode from my personal experience as a voicer and singer, and the lesson I drew from it. The lessons are about vocal learning in general. How about a voice form comes into being, how it persists, and how it continues to transform. The nervous system relies heavily on prediction. Before and during movement, it anticipates the sensory consequences of action and compares those expectations with incoming sensory information. Mismatches generate prediction errors that can be used to adjust behavior and refine sensory-motor coordination. Through this process, the same predictive machinery supports both stability and change. Accurate predictions help maintain skilled performance, while errors drive adaptation. I spent years changing the pronunciation of a single vowel, the I, like "si pro di amici," that initially lay outside the operatic style. In opera, the forms of the letter I are closer to that of a schwa, "si pro di amici." I could recognize the sound, I could vocalize it, but under pressure, in the moment of truth, I would default and go back to the old E, "si pro di amici," the one I've learned 30 years ago. What gradually changed was not only muscular coordination or sensory experience, but the predictions linking action and perception. As those predictions became more reliable, the effortful gesture became automatic. In this sense, vocal expertise can be understood as the progressive calibration of sensory motor models. These models are not fixed. They are continually updated to accommodate bodily change, new constraints, new goals. And such models are built through experience. Early vocal exploration in a newborn allows children to establish the sensory motor mappings that make vocal control possible. Imitation often provides an initial scaffold, but lasting learning depends on developing one's own stable sensory motor prediction, rather than relying only on external models. Because vocal transformation begins long before any pedagogy and continues throughout life. The vocal folds are formed through intrinsic developmental programs, but they remain mechanically sensitive tissues throughout life. Vocal tissue is plastic, as much as the brain is plastic. Cells convert mechanical forces into biochemical signals that remodel the tissues over time, such as the mechanism of mechanotransduction. The same process helps shape the folds' development, and it regulates their ongoing maintenance, repair, structural adaptation. Vocal structure is therefore not independent of use, but it does not depend on use for its initial formation either. Instead, mechanical loading keeps modulating it across the lifespan. What use builds is what conditions its future use. The material state of the vocal folds, their structure, organization, and histories sets the range of actions that they can sustain and the way they respond to further demand. Structure and function form a coupled system in which each continuously constrains and transforms the other. In Nabucco, from Verdi, the bass section have one exposed and demanding passage, the Che si vuol. I don't know if you know the piece. If I sing it without spreading the effort properly, I may end the performance with traumatized tissues. Its significance is not confined to a single event. Vocal tissues are continuously maintained and remodeled throughout life, and every episode of loading feeds into that process. Repeated patterns of use can contribute to adaptation, compensation, or to injury. How an aesthetic demand is met leaves material consequences in this cycle of remodeling. The voice I sing with is partly shaped by how I sing, and how I sing is partly shaped by the voice I have already made. This reciprocal process from conditioning function, form, conditioning function, and function, conditioning and reshaping form, is a pragmatics of the voice, the way voices emerge from practice. Vocal transformation is a movement within and inside this loop. The community in which a voice develops informs the form that it takes. A voice form is shaped by what is explored, stabilized, and discarded around its voice. This collective selection is already part of voice education, not separate from teaching, but distributed across a culture. Singer training works through the same logic. Many coordinative, timbral, and dynamic possibilities are explored. Only some stabilized through practice, through feedback and social reinforcement. Over time, vocal learning reduces variability and consolidates stable patterns. Similar dynamics appear in other vocal learning systems. Songbirds move from early exploratory vocalization to crystallized song through tutoring and feedback. Humpback whales develop population-wide song structures that shift through cultural transmission. The authors cited here call this pruning. The way vocal learners, birds, humans, whales, select their voice forms and pass them on. The kinship across these cases is not acoustic, but functional, expanding a repertoire, selecting workable forms and transmitting them. The mechanisms differ. Neural development involves biological processes such as activity-dependent pruning. Vocal learning and culture, by contrast, operate through behavioral selection and transmission within a community. Selection is functional. Some coordinations withstand physiological load, acoustic constraints, and performance demands much more reliably. It is also cultural. What counts as a good voice depends on historically situated regimes of listening and evaluation. A vocality becomes stabilized as educated when it aligns with these shared norms. I grew up in Rome, where a certain placement associated with the Roman AO is widely used. It really directly connects to the kind of emission that opera singing aims for. In particular, it's very close to what the jargon calls girare, il giro. As someone from Rome, I had an entry point into a specific technique that other people would struggle to explore. In Milan, while running workshops, it became clear that people there had no such entry point. Within their vocal environment, that coordination is less routinely practiced. Yet, we were able to access that voice form by thinking of famous television characters. By imitating them, the participants could easily reach that placement, and we could bring it into their singing. What a voice has at its disposal is largely shaped by what its culture has maintained, stabilized, or left less available. The same coordination can be readily accessible in one context and unfamiliar in another. Holding a voice over time is not only, however, a matter of sound. A singer governs it not only by ear, but by bodily sense. This includes interoceptive and proprioceptive cues linked to breathing, to laryngeal effort, to resonance. These cues are integrated within distributed neural systems, including the insula. Two feedback channels are always in play, the acoustic and the internal. They are continuously reweighted rather than separated. In performance, acoustic feedback becomes less stable due to distance, to delay, to reverberation. Control is then recalibrated by combining listening with felt sensation. And traditions and pedagogies distribute this balance very differently. In Sardinian canto a tenore, for example, the singers cup their hand to the ear to intensify auditory feedback in order to achieve those special overtones that create the timbre of that style. This in turn generates the image connected to the tradition. Man in circle with a cupped hand. In opera, such gestures are discouraged, to the least. More emphasis falls on projection and on trusting embodied sensation when reliable self-monitoring is missing. A conductor once told us in a rehearsal, the hall here helps you. On stage, it won't. But if the technique is good, the sound carries. So the point was not that hearing becomes irrelevant, but that there is no longer enough as a guide. Stability must be inferred from how emission is organized and felt inside the body. And to govern this equilibria over time is to manage physiological load. Vocal production is embedded in allostatic regulation. The body anticipates and adapts to sustained demands on respiration and posture, on laryngeal coordinations. This comes at a cost, distributed across recovery, across rest and daily organization. When demand exceeds recovery capacity, fatigue accumulates and the risk of injury increases. Vocal damage, though, is always multifactorial, is not reducible to effort alone. Take the number from Nabucco again, now over time. To arrive in strength at Va Pensiero, that arrives later, I had to compose a dramaturgy of load, reconfiguring the economy of the week, of the day, of the performance. Overspending in a one forte makes it harder to sustain the piano that follows. I also found that the same sound could be produced through different coordinations and very different physiological costs throughout a concert season. The acoustic results were similar, but the consequences over time were not. These dynamics unfold across nested timescales: the day, with its morning clarity and evening fatigue; the performance, from the first note to the final bow; the season, with repetition and rest. None of these states is final. Even what is called stability depends on an ongoing regulation across these scales. From this perspective, maintaining a voice is not the preservation of a fixed state, but the continuous process by which a system keeps itself viable. To keep a voice the same is already to keep it changing. Maintenance is itself a form of transformation. Let me throw the threads together. I traced vocal learning across 5 mechanisms, and from each a lesson emerged. These 5 lessons are not 5 separate findings. They are 5 ways of looking at one thing: learning. A coherent picture across levels, not a claim that the biology is the same at each. And these 5 lessons can be set in a circle. Arranged that way, they stop being a chain of causes and become a circuit. Each principle feeds the next, and the last returns to the first. The community selects which forms a voice can take. What it selects is learned by feel as much as by ear. Feeling guides action, and action remakes the tissue. The tissue holds not by standing still, but by constant change. And that change retunes what the brain predicts. And so, what can emerge as sound, what can be heard, and what can be selected again? There is no first step. Each principle is at once the effect of the one before it and the condition of the one after. You may enter the circle at any point. This circle is what I mean by the continuity of vocal learning. And continuity here means at least 3 things. First, that learning is continuous. It never stops, from the womb to the last breath. Second, that development, learning, and formal education are continuous with one another. Education is not a force applied from outside to a voice already made. It grafts onto a cycle of learning already turning. Third, that the forces which bring a voice form into being, its genesis, its learning, its coming into the world, are continuous with one another and not separate domains. This is what I call morphogenesis, the genesis of forms, the genesis of voice forms. And yet there is a fracture between the way a voice is formally taught, which is highly exclusive, and the way it is actually learned, which is highly inclusive. The child finding its voice, the humpback whale reshaping its song, and the opera singer learning an area inhabit different worlds. What changes across those worlds are the forms, the constraints, and the histories. What remains continuous is the morphogenetic process through which voices come into being, persist, and transform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And we'll have time for questions, so why don't we rearrange the stage a little bit and bring the chairs, and until then we will give you 5 minutes of discussion.
Yeah, I was thinking that. My partner. It's good that we don't have them at home. You put those kind of, on the free window. But you never have any. Thank you for that. But then she'll also like just wait as we know what it's then well, I think that's kind of what I think anyway.
Okay. May I interrupt the conversation? That's okay. That's okay. May I invite our two speakers on the stage so we can take some questions. I would like to open this floor up to the audience first. I'm sure that you have a lot of questions.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. My question is for Bex. I'm Matthew, by the way. So I really appreciated what you were doing with these castrati as representatives of an Italian tradition. Could you tell us a little more about where they themselves learned? They were marketed as representatives of the Italian tradition. They marketed themselves as that, but what was their actual training? What was their relation to that tradition?
So as far as I know, for Ralzini and Crescentini, they were both taught by like individual teachers rather than an academy, and they were both from Marche, which is like the middle of Italy. But there was these conservatori in Naples, which are kind of like star factories for these conservatori, where I think they usually had a dual role as like part orphanage, part like social institution, and also massive music education venues. And they had like an incredible system of musical learning where it was a mastricelli system where students would teach each other, so emerge not just as practitioners but also fantastic musicians. I think the ubiquity of like incredible training, both through like engagement with the Catholic Church and these academies, meant that like a famous castrato could reasonably be assumed to be from one of these places and have that real engagement with an Italian school of learning. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hello. I was just wondering, in terms of the visual that we have on the screen there at the moment, whether how you see that fits in with, we've seen this sort of move towards motor learning theory and a lot of discussion about motor learning theory in the last kind of few years in voice pedagogy. And I just wondered how, particularly in terms of focus of attention, external versus internal focus of attention, how that fits into maybe the embodied perception leading into the mechanotransduction.
Fully,
Yeah.
100%. And these were only 5 of many, many different domains of motor learning theory that I explored. In terms of internal focus or external focus, it's very interesting. It's a big topic because we, as vocal learners, we kind of prefer to have an external goal in order to achieve it. So if you put your attention inward on the feelings, for example, you block automatisms. You block the predictive processing system. And so if, for example, you focus on your larynx, it's going to be much difficult to achieve a certain voice form. Whereas if you think of filling the room with sound, you have greater chances to fill the room with sound. This is the tensions of vocal pedagogy, you know? For a century, millennia actually, pedagogy is knew this. But now we are giving deeper, we were finding new explanations to the phenomenon. What's interesting, I believe, is that sometimes if you want to change something, you got to block these automatisms. Focusing inward is not to discover some truth about what's happening, but it's to block it, to disrupt it. So the automatism is broken. The predictive model is kind of jammed. And this allows learning to happen in a different way because as we were seeing, it triggers an error, a predicting error. So the brain becomes more plastic and goes like, I don't want to anthropomorphize the brain, but the brain goes like, oh no, wait a moment, and becomes plastic again. And in motor learning, this tension between focusing inward and focusing outward is crucial. And I don't know if I answered the question. And this cycle is also about that. It's also about that.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Jed?
This is for Francesco, just to carry on. So this is about learning, but do you feel that this also applies in performance? So when you have actually specific goals? And could you also maybe address the moment when the imagination arrives in this process?
Thank you for the question. Big question again. Depends on what we mean by imagination. If we talk about imagination in the broadest sense is something. If we are talking about imagery in a more kind of hard science way is something else. So I can imagine the form. Like I was talking about a laccio, my colleague doing a laccio. I have this imagery. I can hear it inside me. It's not about imagination. Or I can think of, let me do one allaccio that sounds like X, Y, Z. This is very different. And they both play a role, very important role. And I think that they talk to each other, but they are not the same thing. So for example, there is a role. There is a role of a certain performance that asks me to do certain things about a passion, because we were talking about passions, right? So we have a passion. I have my text, and on the side, I have one very specific passion. And I imagine that passion. It's very different from having a mind image of how that passion will feel and sound. If I don't have both, I will fail. This is my personal opinion. I will fail. So in performance, it's very important to kind of first disentangle these levels and understand that it's not enough to just say, oh, I want to express X, Y, Z, but asking how would that X, Y, Z would feel, for example, or how would, not to the public, to me, or how would it sound? It's an important question. And then when I entangle again those two levels, imagery and imagination, I get a chance to really achieve the goal, the motor goal. But I got to go through this cycle of learning many times in order to be confident. Otherwise, this is classic, when it's the moment of truth, I go back to the old or whatever. For example, I wanted to express nuance A. I train, but in the end, when I'm on stage, nuance B comes out. Why? Because maybe I had an imagination, I had a certain picture, but my motor imagery at the level of the brain was not very matching, So I understand that approaching the voice art is cannot be about the brain, but I believe that understanding these relationships and these processes can help understanding what goes wrong, for example.
Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. I was actually trying to connect both of your papers, thinking through what your learning cycle can learn us about historical performance practices that are informed by these kind of treatises that Bex was talking about. And maybe you can say a little bit about that.
You want to start, or shall I start?
You can start if you like, yeah.
You sure?
Yeah.
So much. I understand that our papers sounded looked kind of separated, but they were so much integrated in the truth of vocal pedagogy. The example of the castrato is extremely clear. The tradition of castrati is a form of embodiment that has passed and passes every time through these kind of cycles. I don't want to reduce everything to this cycle. This is just a simplification for pedagogical reasons. It's just it could be bigger and have different shapes. But the castrato grows in a community, in a regime of listening where there is, the conservatory training, the castrato master, the chapel, the hall. And all these environments are forces that select certain sounds and prune others. In the case of traditional castrati tradition, there is also this violent surgery going on, which makes it even more clear. But this kind of surgery happens also when there is no physical surgery. And it's not about the sound, it's about how this sound emerges. Moreschi, for example, if you listen to Moreschi now, you may think, this is a head voice. We were talking about registration, no? No, it's not a head voice, it's a chest voice. To the contemporary ear, the same kind of sound can be achieved in very different ways, in very different regimes. I think this is the link. I understand that I am taking too much space, so I give the word to you.
No, I completely agree. I think an important link is the continued interest in singing through time in regime and method. So under the old Italian school, they are literally doing years and years of this solfeggio training before they're allowed to experiment with words and voice. And I think also this interest in methodology is particularly important for figures like Castrati and then maybe later into the 18th century, the diva, because you see with these treatises that they are so rooted in regime and method and interest in doing things in a not formulaic way, but in a very considered and deliberate way. And I think that's helpful for intervening in conversations that imagine castrati and then also divas as kind of monstrous or otherworldly, where it's their talent is kind of divinely instituted onto them rather than something that's a more deliberate process. So I think that's kind of what unites the two papers.
Yeah, there's also something, if I may add, about the fact that in this treatise, these forms of selections, forms of genesis of certain forms are more transparent. You can clearly and transparently see what they're after, in a way that, for example, it's more opaque in other aspects of life. This is also what I was studying in my PhD, there is a continuity between, for example, this treatise and vocal development, the way a newborn develops a certain vocal life, and the way certain singers are asked to achieve certain aesthetic ideals. They're very similar, but at very different levels of transparency. I'm not saying that they are the same. I'm creating an analogy here. But the castrato example is, first of all, fascinating and also very transparent, because you create a voice that is really special. But the same process that created this voice that I'm using to speak to you now is quite similar, if you think about it. So you can use a treatise to study life. This is what I wanted to add.
Sadly, we have time for one last question because we have a shorter break after this. So, please.
My question is for Bex. I found it really interesting to know that the divas were taking their art from the castrati, and I was wondering if you had an opinion on the diva that nowadays try to recreate the castrati's art, because I know the concert tenors try to do it, but also the divas. I think about Cecilia Bartoli. She did a record that is kind of a tribute to Farinelli and trying to recreate that kind of technique that disappeared but is still in the treatise. And also I was wondering if you could share your thoughts about that.
Quite unlucky because I don't actually know the singers that you're talking about, because that was the real end stretch of my master's dissertation, was a kind of epilogue of thinking to the future of what does it mean that for something like diva studies, which is so devoted to retracing and reappraising, for instance, the role of the muse in 19th century opera, and restating their importance in a kind of historiographic tradition that places such an emphasis on the role of the composer, maybe not so much on other performers, where in my a little bit in my paper, but then mostly in my dissertation, I was more engaging with the idea that we can kind of tack castrati onto this legacy, where it's this great energy and interest and really interesting research into reviving the vocal lives and singing lives and teaching lives of these divas can also be extended to the castrati, but I haven't really thought about it the other way around for your question, so that's not really helpful.
Thank you very much, everyone. I highly encourage everybody to continue these discussions outside with tea and coffee. And as a matter of housekeeping, I will give the floor over to Barbara.
Thank you. Actually, it's a very brief break, so feel free to walk, go to the loo, but at 10 past, sorry, it's 15 past 1. So 15 past 1 we are, no, 15 past 12. 12. We are back here. Sorry, my confusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Brilliant.